And we are live with Ian Rowe, a visiting fellow at American Enterprise Institute, who focuses on poverty studies, family formation and structure, and adoption. Also, Mr. Rowe is the CEO of Public Prep, chain of public schools in the Bronx, New York, that are a little bit different in the way that they deliver education and what they teach kids above and beyond the academics. They teach them some other things that will help them be successful in life and beat the odds. And that's really, good morning, first of all, sir.
Good morning. How are you doing?
Thank you. I'm doing well. Thank you for joining us today. I want to just say at the outset, your schools do some of the same things that many high-performing charter schools do in terms of academics and the things that you can do from a pedagogical perspective.
Yep.
Okay, so let's just move that out of the way and just say, okay, you do a lot of the same things that the other schools do in that way. The value add in your approach and philosophy to education is that you teach something called the success sequence. I've also seen it referenced as family education. Tell me why this is important and what it adds to the educational process for low-income students in a place like the Bronx, or if it were to be replicated in any other city where there are low-income students where the outcomes are not good.
Right. Well, first of all, good morning, Chris, and good morning to all your viewers. I hope everyone's safe and healthy during this crazy time. And thanks for having me on. Yes, indeed. I lead a network of public charter schools, Public Prep. We're a network of single-sex public charter schools, so all girls and all boys schools. We have about 2,000 kids across what had been 5 campuses. Now we're doing remote learning for our 2,000 students, and the team is just incredible. Our more than 300 faculty are just committed to the idea that we will not let this pandemic get in the way of our determination to put our kids on a path to college completion. It's hard, but it's just really important. So it might be helpful just to do a little bit of history in what started me, I guess, on this journey. So I've been the CEO of Public Prep for a decade now, and we have had some great success. Our alumni are in some of the best colleges and universities across the country. We're pre-K through 8th grade, and we had very high demand for our schools. This was back in 2016, and I had been doing research on where should we grow our schools. And if you do any research in New York City, you discover pretty quickly that there's lots of need everywhere in terms of high quality options, but especially in the South Bronx. There were some studies done. There were nearly 100 schools in which not a single Black or Hispanic student had passed the math exam. And most of those schools were in the Bronx. I mean, it's just the educational malpractice is just stunning, right? And so we decided to focus our growth. All of our new schools would be in the Bronx. So we moved our headquarters from Tribeca, where you could get a latte on every corner, to 149th Street and 3rd Avenue in the South Bronx. And because that's where our schools were going to be, and that's where our community was. And so why not have our headquarters be there? So one of the first things we did, we decided to do a walking tour of the neighborhood to get to know, where's the local deli, where's the local bank, just to get to know the neighborhood. And along the way, I saw this 27-foot baby blue Winnebago truck where all these people were around it, and they were excited. And it was just interesting because as we got closer to this truck, it had graffiti lettering on it, and it said, "Who's your daddy?" Like, what is that? And it turned out that "Who's Your Daddy" truck, which was so welcomed in this particular community, was a mobile DNA testing center where low-income folks were spending somewhere between $350 to $500 on tests to answer questions such as, could you be my sister? Are you my father? And it was just really deep. It was for me, it was like one of these epiphany moments. Not that if someone who works in the community, as I have for years, knows that issues with family structure are an issue, but it was just, it hit me in a different way. And it forced me to really think differently about the role of schools in what we need to teach the next generation if that's the norm in a given community. And the more research I did, I discovered that there were a lot of communities in which the non-marital birth rate, for example, was, north of 70, north of 80%, especially for women 24 and under. And I start to think, and the implications of that for both the young women and men having children outside of marriage and their children, the data is overwhelming that the likelihood of living in poverty, getting on the school to prison pipeline, mass incarceration, like all the things all of us care about, is dramatically higher if those are the conditions under which a child is brought into the world. And so what role can schools play? And so
let's just stop there for a second. So we are saying if you're 24, if you're 10 years old to 24 years old, you have a child and you're not married.
Yep.
Statistically, it goes off the charts for negative statistics.
Off the chart, at least 5 times likelihood of poverty, all sorts of likelihood of issues beginning in pre-K for your child. So when we talk about, the disproportionality of, Black kids being suspended, some of that has to do with race, but some of that has to do with the instability of the families in which you are being raised in. And we just need to be honest about it. We just need to have the courage to have that conversation. Yeah. It's not seeking to blame the victim, but it is trying to say, what information do we have that we know creates a greater likelihood or less than likelihood of success or not? And if we know that information, what can we teach kids, right?
What do you think is behind the statistical outcomes? I'm a dad, single dad. It's just me and my child. I suddenly have mom back in my life and we get married and we're in the same house now. Let's get out of the statistics. What happens differently in that scenario that can't happen as a single parent?
Well, the current coronavirus is, probably good evidence of the fact that a lot of us are under stress right now, in our homes, trying to do our jobs, if we can do our jobs remotely, if we have, aren't part of the, millions that have lost their jobs. But if you've got kids at home, it's hard. It's hard with 2 parents, just staying on top of kids, earning a living, setting the right example for your kids. It's just hard. Let's just be frank. And by the way, there's no guarantee in life. A child of a single mom, even a young single mom, can ultimately be successful, right? It's just that the challenge to that parent is extraordinary as compared to someone who has, who's in a married, stable, nonviolent relationship. You've got 2 incomes, you've got 2 times the resources. So it's almost like a math problem. And again, it's not trying to cast dispersions or, again, this idea of blaming the victim, but there's just simply a difference when you've got 2 people heavily engaged in the education of their kids. And there's lots of data. Robert Putnam has written about this in Our Kids, a great book to read up. But if you look at any studies, how much time, I think he calls it good night moon time, like how much time, parents in married 2-parent households spend reading to their children, spending resources after school, all of those things. To some, it's unfair, to some degree, it's the privilege, which is true. But, to some degree, these parents are doing what they believe is right for their kids. I want to ensure the next generation knows what the likelihood that that's going to be the chance, that they will have the choices in their lives to do the same things with their kids.
Okay. So Ian, I got to tell you, you're already pushing buttons, right? so, and I'm sure you haven't, what I'm about to say to you next isn't a surprise. You've heard it before. Raymond Ankrum, one of my colleagues from the 8 Black Hands podcast, says, so we're blaming parents now. And he also says this is deficit thinking. And it's almost like a black gaze. I don't know what the black gaze part of it is, but you have certainly heard this before within our community, that when you give this message about, well, I don't know what you would call it, family formation or family structure is what you're talking about. Generally, you get the feedback, the pushback immediately that you're blaming the victim. And I wonder if you have a good reason to yourself why you think that that's the way that it's received.
Oh, no, I totally understand it, because there are people that hear this message and then choose to weaponize it against marginalized communities. They choose to say, see, it's the people themselves. They're putting themselves into this own situation. So therefore, they should not have access to the right public policy. And so it's totally understandable why people would fear these arguments being made in public, because there are some that use it against the very people we're trying to protect. I hear that. But here's the reality. We could have this whole conversation completely divorced from Black people and just focus on white people. The non-marital birth rate amongst young women in the white community is actually at the highest rate of all major demographic groups. And guess what? There's a reason there's an opioid crisis. There's a reason there's a large working class poor in the white community. In some ways,
Ian, are we sure about that though? Because I just want to challenge this a little bit.
Yep.
You have places, urban and rural, in the United States where the entire economy fell out the bottom, meaning you used to be a coal town and everybody worked in coal, and you're not there anymore. It's not there anymore. You used to have a Hormel plant where if you didn't go to college, you didn't have to, because you could still buy a truck, buy a house, have a girlfriend or wife, and go to the bar every Friday night because you were working at the Hormel plant. Hard work, but it paid. It paid well. There are places here in Minnesota where you have large populations of white people that are working in non-college jobs, and there's a way to make a living at it. But if you look at a place like Gary, Detroit, Chicago, Appalachia, the Rust Belt, you have the aftermath of kind of like economic fallout, like Blitzkrieg. The bottom just fell out. The idea that you're going to have a normal civic society becomes way less when the economy falls out, right? So is the driver of the opioid, and in the 80s, the crack epidemic and all those things, the sudden increase of unmarried people? Or is it the sudden increase of the number of families that were formed before that no longer can handle the stress of financial insecurity because industry has left?
Yep. I mean, I think what challenges this debate always is that folks want a silver bullet answer to every problem, and it just doesn't exist that way. Life.
You mean you don't have one, Ian?
Oh
my God, this show is over now.
And by the way, two-parent families are not a silver bullet, right? There is no guarantee in life, right? And the reason I focus so much about the next generation is what do we teach the next generation about what your likelihood of success is based on the decisions that you control, right? There will be economic dislocation. There will be a pandemic, right? 4 months ago, who would have thought we would be in the situation we're in? And frankly, what's going to happen over the next 2 to 3 years as we roll as a country out of this? And so there is no silver bullet. You're absolutely right.
So there's no silver bullet, but I do want, right now at this point, I do want to share with people, because you just touched on it, a set of behaviors that, regardless of everything else that happens in the world, can help you beat the odds. Like it's your best weapon. What is that sequence of things? What you call the success sequence. Let's just break that down for folks listening or watching what that is.
Yeah. And so, and by the way, the success sequence is not a term that I've coined. It's data that was first developed at the Brookings Institution. Even before that, there were certain researchers behind it. But when it comes to social science, there's a lot of analysis of failure. Right. There's a lot of why do certain communities persist in poverty generation after generation? And a lot of that research has revealed that there are structural barriers around race, gender, class, which are real, right? And cannot be discounted. And we need to ensure we are always thinking about those structural barriers and those systemic challenges. But what the folks at Brookings and others have said, okay, well, that's true. So is there a population that has actually succeeded over time? Is there an actual, as measured by entry into the middle class, right? And so therefore Brookings did this analysis and said, is there a population of people, regardless of race, regardless of where they started on the income level, and and they succeeded. They entered the middle class, and then the next generation sustained. Is there anything in common?
Mm-hmm.
Is it that, is it that they were just born with certain characteristics that, they just automatically landed in the middle class, or was there anything common around this huge group of people? And so they disaggregated, they did, reverse regression analysis, and they simply came up with a certain set of behavioral factors. The first is finishing high school, not even finishing college, but finishing high school.
Mm-hmm.
Two is getting a full-time job of any kind, right? Doesn't matter. Just so you learn the dignity and discipline of work at any salary, just so you had a full-time job.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you had children, you got married before, right? Those three steps. Based on the data, the people who had taken those steps, 98% of them avoided poverty.
Okay, so let's stick with it for a second. This is just 3 steps.
Yep.
Graduate high school, don't get pregnant before marriage, and get a job.
Full-time job. Yes.
Full-time job. Just be working, and it doesn't matter if you start at the bottom somewhere. If you do those 3 things, 98% of the people who do those 3 things avoid poverty.
98% of the people who did those things have avoided poverty. Again,
okay.
It's very important to ground this entire conversation in this is not prescriptive, it is descriptive. In the sense of, ultimately, every school in America should be about building young people who have a sense of agency, that they understand the rewards and consequences associated with the decisions that they make. And what this is trying to do is to share that information. Because when I learned this info, first of all, I was like, wow, I've never heard of any public policy that has this level of outcome. I mean, maybe you have. I'm not aware of any that's had that level of success. And as I started to ask people, other educators, is this something that you're aware of? And the answer was no. And oftentimes I got the response of, not only is it no, we probably shouldn't even be talking about it, because that might risk, offending people, or again, the whole blaming the victim thing. And this is just information. This is much needed information young people in our communities need to know.
When you say there's no public policy like this, you're not calling these 3 steps a public policy. You're saying that by contrast, we haven't done anything in public policy that is as powerful.
Exactly. That's exactly what I mean.
These 3 set of behaviors. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, I'm, the thing that always mystifies me is why these things can't coexist. So public policy that exists to address the very same issues, we should be working hard on those fronts to remove systemic barriers, right? To break the cycle of poverty, to break the school to prison pipeline, all of those things, while also educating kids about the decisions that they have in their control. And to me, it's an empowerment message for young people. And in some ways, it's almost irresponsible not to share this information with kids. Now, there are questions about, when is it developmentally appropriate? Should this be taught in middle school, high school? Like, I'm designing a high school network now, where it'll definitely be, part of the curriculum. So, reasonable people can disagree on, at what point kids should learn this info. But, like in New York City, there's an after-school program sanctioned by the city where, 8th graders learn the 14 different ways to use a condom. Like, okay. If that's appropriate information, then maybe we can tell kids about the
That's
decision.
a good point, though. This is a great point, Ian, in that comprehensive sexual education actually is superior to abstinence only. And abstinence only is the preferred public policy of people that have this kind of moral behavior strategy for improving people's lives, for instance, right?
Yeah.
So I don't really have a dog in that race, because, I'm going to make my own decisions with my kids, like what I think is developmentally appropriate for them, given our faith and given our home values. But research, we're just going to talk about research. Yep. The moral play on just don't have sex is akin to just get married before you have a kid, and things will be better.
Yeah, and that's not what I'm advocating for. I mean, in a former life, I was at MTV, and for 6 years I
Mm.
ran MTV's what's called pro-social programming. So if you're familiar with like Rock the Vote or Choose or Lose, we got 23 million young people to vote in 2008. In the presidential election, ran campaigns around fight for your rights, protecting your sexual health. And the thing that always resonated with our audience when we were reaching young people is treating young people like thinking independent, thinking human beings that deserve to know all of their options, and then to understand what are the rewards and consequences associated with each. And then you decide. So it's not about abstinence only, or larks or other. Share this information accurately and comprehensively with kids. And I believe over time, most young people, or most people, will make the decision that makes the most sense in their life. That doesn't mean that someone may still not choose to, for example, have a child outside of marriage. And if they do it and they're ready, then that's a very different situation than what we find today, which is that many kids are not ready, and that has consequences both for their individual family and society at large.
What's our evidence that kids are not getting this message already, that it's not being preached to them for the ones of them that go to church, for the ones of them that are being raised by grandparents who say things to you like what Black grandparents have said to you forever: once you get an education, no one can take it away from you. Don't quit a job without having another job. I mean, there are these Negro proverbs that have existed forever that basically have a lot of what you're saying right now in them, embedded in them. I mean, I know I got that message from people who didn't follow it themselves. Right?
Yeah, it's interesting.
Right.
I mean, look, there's certain communities around the country that there's no need to talk about this because it is just the norm. Like, either you're in a community where there are lots of married 2-parent households and people are going to work every day, and so you see what the rites of passage are into young adulthood. So you don't necessarily need school to play this role. But unfortunately, that doesn't exist in many communities. I mean, about a year and a half, 2 years ago, when I was doing, research for the high school design, I was visiting high schools. I went to a high school in New Orleans, and I visited a ninth grade class, a pretty good high school. And I asked the teacher if I could, just share with the students a problem I was grappling with. And he said, sure. So I started and I said, hey, thanks for having me join your class. And, if I have I'm trying to figure out if I should incorporate something into my curriculum. So let me ask you something. And I said this to the class. If you knew that there were a set of strategies that were in your control, that the people who've done them 98% of the time avoided poverty, would you want to know? And everyone in the classroom were like, yeah, of course we'd want to know. And I said, well, no. There are people who think if I share it with you, that I shouldn't share it with you, that somehow, maybe your heads will explode. Maybe it might insult you. It might insult your family. So I don't want to share it with you. And their response was, tell us. And just what was interesting about it, and so then we proceeded to have a conversation where I shared exactly what I shared with you. And a couple of kids were, wait, are you telling me to get married? I'm like, no, I'm not telling you to get married. What I'm telling you is that there is information about people who have been in your situation in the past, who face the same kinds of structural barriers that you do, and that here are the series of decisions that they made, and rewards and consequences. And by the way, you show the consequences related to high school, work, marriage, children. You also showed the series of consequences with different series. And then at the end of the class, it was like, thank you. It's not as if their whole life changed in that one class, but I could tell that, I don't know, I felt that they felt respected, that someone would give them information that is readily available to a lot of other folk, but isn't necessarily available to kids in low-income communities.
Yeah, I just want to push back on something. And that's what this discussion is always about. You and I agree on a ton of things, and we share lots of ideas in common. So when I push on these things, it's no disrespect to the ideas. It's just an intellectual kind of like discussion about it.
We need more debate within the Black community in particular how we advance our community. And
so this is what I want to say, though, about that, because I think that, first of all, this conversation often happens in white conservative circles and in white conservative forums, right? So if this is really a conversation about what Black people need to have and low-income people need to have within their own communities, it does look suspicious that it always takes place in white conservative circles and white conservative environments, right? That just is what it is, right?
Yep,
like wherever I fall on the political spectrum, yep, I'm just going to call a thing a thing.
Yep, I agree.
Which instantly makes that suspicious and suspect. There is also something that happens with weaponizing. You used that word earlier, weaponizing something like this that could be a fairly benign conversation within the Black community, but weaponizing it to say, see, this is a stronger driver than racism or discrimination or gender oppression or the history, the structural racism, yep, or whatnot. That's when it loses its steam in my mind, because it's not, those two things are different discussions. I think you can have one on its own merits.
Of course.
First of all, you could just have this discussion on its merits. The other thing I want to challenge, though, about that is this idea that we're afraid to have the conversation in Black communities, or we have to be brave to have it, or, like it's not happening already or whatnot. That feels like an outsider view of the Black community that I know. Right.
Well, what's interesting about that is I think we do have it. I mean, there's no question. I get a lot of feedback from, let's see, members of my own community, both positive and negative. But a lot of it is, Ian, it's so important you're talking about this, but we can't air our dirty laundry in public. Like there is some fear. And again, I get it. There's some fear that if this goes past our safe confines, right? Let's just say that somehow, mm-hmm, it will then fall into easy fodder for opponents, mm-hmm, to then say, I'm not going to spend X amount on public policy, or I'm not going to spend on reparations, or I'm not going to spend on XYZ intervention. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And the fear is that somehow talking about personal responsibility, I said those words, right, or mm-hmm, personal, or things like family structure, will, in some people's view, take the attention away from the real problem, which is structural racism, the structural barriers, which are, mm-hmm, real. And what I think we as a people need to figure out a way is, how do these conversations coexist? Because, I just listened to this thing on reparations a couple days ago. I think it's somewhere between, estimates vary, but somewhere between $4 to $8 trillion, mm-hmm, has to be, mm-hmm, allocated by the U.S. government in order to close the racial wealth gap between Black and white people. Like, I don't know when we think that that's happening, but mm-hmm, in the meantime, what are we going to teach kids today, mm-hmm, right? Kids today who don't have 10 years to wait for some vast social transformation, while we are all working on that vast social transformation, by the way. Mm-hmm. But in the meantime, we need to have a different conversation about what we need to teach our kids today, mm-hmm, about the choices in their control. And, mm-hmm, to me, it's, I honestly don't even know, like, what else are we supposed to do? Just wait until, like, we need more Black teachers in the classroom. Sure, absolutely. We need more great, mm-hmm, teachers, period. Like, all of these things, we need them. But it's not as if those things are happening anytime soon, nor should it diminish our energy and impatience, mm-hmm, to get those things done.
So on this point, this is a good point, because you and I were talking a little bit before this conversation, and this is something I will say to many people that are sitting in your seat right now when we have this conversation. Integration is not going to happen anytime soon, but people are putting a lot of time, effort, and money around it. Black teachers in the classroom aren't going to happen anytime soon, but a lot of people are putting time, effort, because they're trying to build a future. The fact that you have 75% unwed people having babies between the age of 10 and 24 is also not going to change anytime soon. And on Monday, there are going to be people teaching our kids next Monday. And the people who are going to, this is the distinction I like to make when I have these conversations all the time. There are pedagogical interventions in schools, and there are sociological proposals for interventions in schools. But schools are primarily academic institutions. Now, what I've heard you say about this before is, yes, we have to do well there. And there is this broader set of things that also drive performance in the school. We can't pretend like things don't come in to the school from outside that have impact. But the schools are not getting the pedagogical part right. So it makes, I think, some folks like me nervous when people want to jump to sociological things before they have fixed the fact teachers don't know how to teach reading. The way that we train and induct teachers is all wrong and broken. The people that we are selecting, we don't pull them from the top of the cognitive pool in colleges, right? They're just, I could go on and on and on in ways in which once we do have the teachers, the ones with the poorest evaluations end up in Black schools. None of these things that I'm saying right now have anything to do with family structure, right? So reformers have been right for a long time to focus on the pedagogical things within our control as schools. I think what you're saying is, in addition, you're not saying either or, you're saying in addition to that, families have to think about their locus of control.
I mean, at the end of the day, students need to think about their locus of control. It's not either or, and unfortunately, it is all of these things. We need teachers to, teach reading better. It's true, but the reality is, for kids born into married two-parent households versus young single motherhood situations, the data is overwhelming that the vocabulary those kids hear is more. It just is. It's not, and again, it's not blaming the victim, but if we know these things when we're teaching to the next generation before they've made decisions around family formation, what should we teach them around the likelihood that they will have a better situation for themselves and their own children? And by the way, like when you said there are a lot of folks working on integration, absolutely, but I just think it's really important to say that there's always this underlying message when it comes to integration, that there's this underlying idea that, in order for Black kids to be successful, they have to be in a predominantly white environment, right? Or there has to be, and look, I mean, sure, I mean, I think schools that are diverse racially, socioeconomically are fantastic, right? But it's not as if our schools in the South Bronx, suddenly there's going to be a huge influx of, wealthy, affluent white American, families that put their kids in that school, right? I mean, I told you the story earlier. When I was 12 years old, we had my parents, we'd moved from Brooklyn to Queens, and we were living in this neighborhood in Laurelton that was, that was slowly being integrated, predominantly white Italian, and now had been, becoming more racially diverse. And my junior high school started having some racial tensions, and so the school board decided to open an annex, another junior high school building in Rosedale, in a relatively white part of town, right? And so most of the white parents in my school took their children out of our school and sent them to the annex, right? And my Jamaican parents, who had come to this country determined to have their kids have a better education, they were going to take me out of my school and send me there on the premise that where the white kids go, it's going to be a better education. And I will always remember the Sunday night. My dad was in his recliner, my mom was, on the sofa, and I begged and pleaded and cried with my parents. Like, I mean, well, I love
to let you
teachers.
stay in the school, let you stay in the Black school. Yeah,
it wasn't, to me, it wasn't the Black school. It's like,
but it was. But it was.
No, it was. But the point was, it wasn't because it was suddenly, I mean, why is it that if the white kids go there, our education has to be worse? I love my teachers, I love my friends, and they allowed me to stay.
Yeah,
they allowed me to stay. It was the first time I ever challenged my parents on anything. But it's just like, anyway, I just think it's always important because, charter schools, for example, we are predominantly in locations that is, predominantly low income, predominantly one race, or Black and Hispanic. So we don't have time for presumptions like integration is the key to success. Because if we're waiting for that, I should write a book called In the Meantime, like all the things that we're waiting for.
Well, wait a second, though, because you're kind of a victim of the thing that you're saying right now, which is this thing where everybody's going to be married parents who graduate high school is not coming anytime soon either.
No. Again, it's really important. Because it's really important. I'm not trying to say everyone needs to follow this set script. I'm saying young people deserve to be taught all of the information that evidence shows has a huge impact on their likelihood of success in life, their sense of personal agency, their locus of control. Because when you're young and you start to make certain decisions, your ability to control your environment shifts based on decisions you make. That's not you know, as you said, like in white conservative circles, they have this discussion. They do, and that's just a reality. And frankly, I think there are a lot of Black people that have this conversation, you know, internally too. But again, I think there's this fear that somehow, I'm going to read you a quote actually from someone who sent me you know, a single mom, Black woman. You know, let's be real, Ian. Ed reformers instill into kids: study, work hard, and go to college. How about don't get pregnant, study, work hard, and go to college? Why can't we say that to kids and ask their parents to do so as well? Let's have this much needed conversation about what folks seem to think we, single mothers with kids, will feel offended about when we're not offended. You know, so I just think there is more of an opportunity for us to have this discussion. And to me, it's about empowerment of our own people. We don't have to wait until, you know, white people make decisions about our community in order for our, you know, community to advance forward. And I know that that's not what everyone is saying, but sometimes it feels like we emphasize the structural barriers so much to the point where you could think that we don't have the ability to control our own destiny.
You're pushing everybody's buttons, Ian.
But why is that? Why?
I'm just reading through the comments here, and the comments are really along the lines of blaming the victim, deficit thinking. There is a person here with a name that I seem to recognize named Joshua Israel Stewart, who says the idea that disparities will be overcome by white people lecturing Black people about somehow having inferior cultural decisions versus taking responsibility for systemic racism and a history of oppressive institutions seems offensive. That last part, seems offensive, is a very Minnesota way of saying it is offensive. Right. Just to be.
Can we do both things? Can we confront the historical biases and fight?
Yeah. Let me show you something, Ian. I just want to add something here. Let's look at the screen. All right. So I'm sharing my screen with you right now.
Yeah.
Right. Now let me refresh it because I want it to do the thing that it does.
Most white boys.
Okay, so this is
this is the Raj Chetty study.
Yeah, this is a real-time.
I'm very familiar with
graphic. You've seen this. This is in the New York Times, and these dots that are falling, the blue ones are Black boys, and the more orange ones or yellow color are white boys, and it is showing that kids who grow up rich, presumably in educated two-parent households because they're rich and they're wealthy, have very different outcomes in life. And what this graphic is dynamically showing you in real time is the number that fall out of the upper class into the poor or the lower middle, the middle class or the upper class, right? And there are vast differences here. Same type of families, same family structure, same advantages in life, given very, high advantages, as a matter of fact. And something structurally is happening here in real time as we're watching this. Now, I'm not going to say that, you're probably going to understand this better than I do. You just mentioned right now, the researcher, Chetty. So that tells me you're familiar with this or whatnot. And there's a lot of nuances to this.
But before you go further, because this is a really, really, really important point. And I'm actually glad you raised it, because this is a New York Times analysis. And the headline of this article, if I remember it correctly, was called "The Punishing Reach of Racism." There you go. Okay. See that?
Yeah,
it is.
And so data shows punishing reach of racism for Black boys.
Because if you look at the surface data, it shows that if you're Black, even if you're born in the highest quintile, you fall down, right? So if you read this New York Times story and you read this data, you will come to the conclusion it is futile. We are in a racist, white supremacist country where the very fact of being Black and a boy, you are doomed, right? What's interesting about this study is that they didn't find the same differences about Black girls. But that's another conversation. But the key piece of information that I think is maybe in one sentence in this particular article, but then go to the Raj Chetty study. Just in general, people read the research, not the interpretations of the research. The single biggest difference when you look at the performance of Black boys in particular, was if there was a presence of a father in the home or a concentration of fathers in the neighborhood. the so-called neighborhood effect, that had a dramatically different impact on actually those charts that seem to go like this. When there was a presence of a father in the home or in the neighborhood, it actually rises up. That's critical information, right? It's like, okay, if absent all other factors, this makes a difference, then why aren't we talking about that? That's not blaming the victim. That's not
okay,
trying
see,
to...
I want to keep going back to this though, is like, so let me make a provocative point here about this.
Wait,
I agree with you on a lot of this, but
what do you think
keep
about
saying
that?
you keep saying we don't talk about this, and I'm just wondering,
okay,
like, what our evidence is of what the nature of our conversation is right now. Because if we want to change the nature of the conversation, we have to have an accurate kind of idea of what the conversation is now. So what are people talking about in churches? What are people talking about in faith communities or non-faith communities? What are millennials talking about differently than older people, are talking about? What does all of this mean in the Tinder age, right? In the age of, Tinder and Bumble and, all those things, the way that people date differently now than they ever did. This could be a very rich discussion, but it gets really, it feels simplistic sometimes. And I want to say that this is the provocative point that I'll make for you that I think is challenging for you. I think that the integrity of this conversation has done damage every time it is had and framed by white conservatives instead of by Black conservatives, moderate people, centrist, liberals, and others. And the reason that I do is because and I watched a lot of the interviews with you, like in prep for this conversation. So when you and I talk just generally, I agree with you on like so many things. Like we're right there. But the way you get set up all the time in conversation is, this is the guy who's going to tell us that racial structural barriers and this overwokeness and all that stuff that Black people concentrate on is okay to not see as the problem anymore, because he's going to tell us that something we do agree with is the problem, which is Black behavior.
And by the way, just for the record, I disagree with that. Right? That to
you
me
do, but they set you up that way, and you're in rooms of people where they set you up that way, and I think it does the conversation damage over time, because we know that that's not an honest discussion either. Right.
So here's the thing. So we need to know that there are going to be some people who choose to use this information in that negative way. What we, in my view, Black people who are concerned with the outcomes of Black people, and frankly, this is now a conversation that does transcend race. We need to know that that is going to happen. It is. But that doesn't diminish what we should teach the next generation, the kids in our schools today, the kids who are 10, 11, 12, 13 years old. I'm not blaming these 10, 12, 13-year-olds for cultural deficiencies or whatever the question with that, very, very fair question, because they haven't yet had the chance to make these decisions. So the question is, we as educators, what should we teach kids? I don't have, it's not as if I have the 27-year-olds in my school. So the fact that they don't have marriageable men, that's a real issue, right? That is a real issue. But I'm not trying to speak to them. I'm trying to speak to the 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15-year-olds about what is ahead of them. And ahead of them includes structural barriers around race. It also includes enormous opportunities. I mean, there are more than 100 colleges and universities that offer world-class education completely tuition-free for kids within a certain income bracket. We should be telling kids about that too. So it's know your full series of options, and in particular those behaviors that have landed people in different economic classes, and know the probabilities.
Yeah. So are you thinking that is the idea in this discussion that if we were to scale this up across American public schools across the country, that we made this a main part of our pedagogy, that we teach kind of character education, the success sequence, behavioral, self-regulation type things, that we would see an improvement in, for instance, something like test scores and high school graduation rates and college going and college finishing if we did that?
I mean, I think there's a lot of evidence in the academic realm around character-based strengths like self-regulation, self-control, the ability to delay gratification. Those are things that are already, I think a lot of schools are attempting to instill what we call character-based strengths in kids in order to achieve academic outcome, in order to improve higher academic outcomes. And yeah, I think that this becomes another set of data. Again, in most schools, there's no issue talking about a future orientation around college and career, right? It's the thing that starts to bleed into timing of family formation that I think gets people very on edge. But college, career are some things that are baked into the mission statements of many educational organizations. And for me, because college and career are two of the first things that you do to build the foundation of your life. And for most people, they do have children. And so the question is, if there's information, if there's real data that shows that there are better times for that decision to be done, especially what should happen before then to give you a greater likelihood of success, why would we deprive kids of that?
So I mean, and I get it. Like, I don't think we should deprive kids of it. I'm thinking about the two conversations here.
Yep.
And I'm thinking about two sides. If I'm trying to be objective, which I am always trying to be objective in this, I have my own ideas, my own feelings. But if I'm talking with you, I want to give respect to your ideas and I want to play with them a little bit.
Yep.
So if I'm thinking about the two conversations here, the conversation with people that are on the side that wants to fight structural racism and historic oppression and marginalization of people, I'm
on that side, by the way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, here's the thing, because you might be on a meta at a meta level on this, because you're probably going to agree with what I say, that we have to be having more than one conversation. So if we're going to talk about the structures, we also can talk about the things within our locus of control to change, right? So that's actually the challenge to the other side that loves your message about personal responsibility and behavior change and all of that stuff. The challenge for them on their side of the fence is, don't think that because we agree with this, that it's going to stop us from coming for you.
Correct.
With the fact that your police are racist and the statistics show it out. The research, as much as we want to pull up research about family structure, we can pull up research about bias in the classroom and bias in the very white female teacher core, and the difference between a black teacher with a black boy and a white teacher with a black boy, especially if the the white teacher is a woman. The fact that, like, when we send out, in some cities, we send out a white couple and a black couple with the exact same application to do apartment shopping. They have the exact same credit history, the exact same job, and the exact same performance, and it steers where they can live. That's not because of their family structure or their personal behavior or their personal responsibility. It's because of racism baked into the system. Because where you live, if something so simple as where you can get a house or an apartment is skewed by race, there's a whole bunch of other factors that hurt you after that. Just like by isolating you. So the idea that we can agree on the behavior, but we're not going to stop coming for you on the structural stuff, is the challenge to the other side. But let me add something else to this. That, unless you want to, do you want to say anything about that?
I guess I just want to emphasize again. I think sometimes I may frustrate people in that I agree with everything that you just said, which is that, and I've faced it in my own personal life, right? I think one of your listeners just wrote, the people who have this position are typically people who are against teaching safe sex in schools. Hello, we have to teach safe sex in schools. Like, these things are not mutually exclusive. And so I can both acknowledge that there are real housing discrimination practices that impede the ability of Black people to move into communities that they have every right to move into. And we need to address that. I can agree with that, and simultaneously say that the kids of that Black couple or of that Black child should be taught the ways in which, if that reality exists 30 years from now, what is their best likelihood of overcoming that discrimination then and now, right? To me, they're not mutually exclusive. So I get frustrated when people want to put me in a box or put this argument in a box, because it somehow is implying that by arguing one, you're diminishing the validity of the other. It's just not true.
I think that's the context of where the conversation is happening.
Right.
So if this was a conversation that was happening at the National Association of Black Fraternities and Sororities organizations, the Black, or the Southern Baptist Convention on the Black side of that, or Jack and Jill, or just keep naming like Black organizations, Urban League and NAACP, if they were having a pro-family, strong family, let's restore the family, and let's talk about best practices in terms of family-friendly policies, family-forming policies rather than family-breaking policies, which, is widely what our economic policy is, then it would be seen differently, I think.
No. The more quote unquote Black institutions that advocate this message, for sure. I mean, the one thing I would amend is that this isn't only about family friendly. Ultimately, it's about this idea of agency and your ability to make decisions and be the master of your own fate, right? So timing of family formation is certainly one factor, but finishing school, full-time work, these are also important elements. That's why this sequence, or what I call the pathways to power, isn't just about family or when you choose to have sex. It's about finishing your education. It's about getting full-time job. Because all of these are building blocks to you learn responsibility, you learn all of those things. You also put yourself in different networks of people that potentially most people find their love mates. So it isn't just about family, because I think that is if people hear pro-family, they hear, oh no, this is family values, and we're back to the cultural wars.
Well, which I don't mind, actually. I don't mind family, like a focus on the family, maybe not called that, but a focus on the family and the Black family, I don't think is as politically charged as even the way that we're talking about this right now. But I love your frame around agency. I think that is actually the much stronger, better frame to use in this, that gets us out of blaming. To tell people that they have power is different than telling them that they're behaving poorly.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that's the better frame here. So let me just say something about this last part that I just said, behaving poorly. The reason that I think something like this is so tough is because I believe that behavior change and culture change, especially radical behavior change and radical structural change, is incredibly difficult. It's incredibly difficult to help people do, and it's incredibly difficult for them to do. And here's my proof of that point. For the 49% of Americans that are either obese or overweight who are listening to this right now, you are not practicing the success sequence. All of the information in the data tells you that everything that you put in your mouth has an effect on your health, but still you are not changing your behavior. You are not stopping yourself from eating the things that do damage to you, right? So anybody who's listening to this who is has poor health that's diet related, who smokes and can't stop smoking, and has health consequences because they just won't stop smoking, who live sedentary lifestyles but won't just won't stop sitting. It's no judgment on them to basically say behavior change was really hard. And if we're talking about mass behavior change across the country, it seems incredibly hard.
So here's the thing. It is absolutely enormously difficult. Again, from my time at MTV, I mean, I ran some of the largest youth-focused behavioral change campaigns around voting, sexual health, gay marriage. How do we get literally millions of young people in particular to change the way they change the kinds of intimate decisions that they make? And guess what? There's actually some really great examples of how it's been done. It doesn't just happen in a year. If you look at the national campaign to prevent teen pregnancy, right, that started back in 1992, 94, almost 70% drop over the last 25 years. And it's been done through a combination of public policy, public service advertisements, celebrities. So there is a way to change behavior. I mean, when I was at MTV, we were looking at very high levels of teen pregnancy rates. It was that evidence that helped us create the show 16 and Pregnant. Because we said, okay, how are we going to talk to 16-year-olds who are feeling they're independent, they don't know what the consequences are. I don't know, let's create a show about what it means to be 16 and pregnant. And for a while, there was real evidence that pinpointed watching that show and more self-regulation behavior amongst young people. It is one of the hardest things to change en masse personal individual decisions, but there was a way to make it happen. And again, if you look at attitudes around gay marriage, which I fought very hard for when I was at MTV, so when that Supreme Court decision, it was amazing, right? And voting, youth voting, like there are ways to reach young people in particular that we can learn from, and I think pointed in this context. And schools should play a role in this larger effort to know that young people do have agency even in the face of structural barriers.
So I want to say this because I want you and I are going to work together, Ian, and we're going to keep talking about this. So I hope you take this conversation as like an addendum to the previous conversations we've already had about this. I'm trying to find a middle ground on this. Your frame about agency actually is interesting in that Charles Cole, my colleague, Dr. Charles Cole, my colleague from the 8 Black Hands podcast, talks a ton about agency and agentic Black people, what he calls agentic Black people. And he says that basically Black people, you're on your own. So what are you going to do now? Like pretend that you're on your own and what are you going to do now? And agency is the only thing that are going to win. There's still a gap between the way you're approaching that, he's approaching that, but I think there's some interesting Venn diagram that could happen between those two things, and we should keep doing it. At the risk of blowing up this conversation by saying something provocative at the end that is going to be a much longer conversation, I will say this, and Ray Ankrum is watching, who is also my colleague from 8 Black Hands podcast, who's going to give me a hard time about this. But while you were at MTV working on this positive social programming, I blame MTV, Viacom, and BET for out the other end producing a fire hose of toxic family-killing media for profit that only got worse, more disgusting and gutterish and outrageous over years and over time. So anyways,
hey man, look, here's the deal. Serious. I'm actually so glad you raised it. So MTV, they had a show called Tila Tequila. I mean, I remember some of the worst garbage ever, right?
Yeah.
But I was the guy inside this, large, enterprise that had the attention of literally hundreds of millions of young people worldwide. And so the garbage, in my view, which was being spewed, was being consumed. And how could I essentially infiltrate this organization to embed messages so that within Real World, one of the most popular shows at the time on MTV, we had all sorts of messages around safe sex when the characters were involved in actually dubious behaviors. So it is interesting. So you're right. I've been at the White House. I've been at lots of big platforms for which I have felt the need to essentially infiltrate those institutions in such a way that we provide empowering information to the very audience that others are trying to, enfeeble or make weak. And I want to make them strong. I want to make young people in our community strong. And, that was what I did at MTV. That's what I do running schools. And we just
I'm getting, just so you know, in the comments here, I'm getting the okay boomer thing. I'm not a boomer, I'm a Gen Xer, but I'm getting the okay old man thing from younger people. Look. Right? So I'm getting the ha 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 on this. But it's important because you worked at MTV and you're pushing this thing about behavior change. I do think it's interesting to point out that school as a medium for transferring information is not as powerful as media as a tool for transferring thoughts, messages, ideas, transmitting those that stick, right? That stick with that move the culture. I can guarantee you right now, if the entire media culture changed toward 100% family formation, positive programming and thinking, we'd have a huge change.
Right. And especially if we're about empowerment and agency, right? Because especially if the message is about, do you want to be the master of your fate? Do you want to be the captain of your destiny? Like, that is what I want for every young person in this country. And there are behaviors that give you a better shot at you having that mastery in your own life. And kids deserve to have that information.
Well, I appreciate it. Will you come back again? Can we keep
course,
talking
man,
about this? Okay,
course.
I want to keep talking about this. This is a hot conversation to keep having,
Yes.
and I think it's provocative. That's why I like it. I just like it because I think I get bored. I'm bored with our, with our kind of like, our stale conversation right now. So, anything that's provocative that gets us thinking, you are absolutely, I think, a rarity. In the way that you bring grace to this discussion and you bring grace to the ideas that you have around this. You're open to being pushed back on it. You just got a way of doing this. You're a great person on this.
Wow.
So I appreciate it. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. And look, man, we are all in this together. We are all in this together. A lot of us have been in this game for a long time. We've seen policies come and go, and we haven't seen the improvement that we all seek. And we need to just expand our repertoire of interventions and, giving young people the information to be captains of their own destiny has got to become part of that strategy.
I love that. Well, that's where we'll end for our viewers and for our listeners. You've been listening to Ian Rowe, who's the CEO of Public Prep in the Bronx, New York, a series of charter schools, a network of charter schools that are well-performing and also teach life skills that are helping kids in more ways than just academics. You can find him on Twitter at Ian V. Rowe. That's ROWE on Twitter. And Ian, is there anything else you want to point people towards? Do you have any reports or anything like that you think are good for people to pay attention to?
On my Twitter feed of my essays, look, I'm open to having this conversation, and I'll send you information, Chris, that you can post on your side as well that I think would be very helpful for folks to read on how to advance this discussion and to just think differently about the role that schools can play in building agency amongst our young people.
Excellent. Thank you for coming on. To the listeners, to the viewers, to the people who come to this broadcast every day. You're making my day by doing it. You're making my life. These are tough conversations that we're having, but I enjoy it. And I enjoy it more now that I know that people are watching and that they're commenting and that they're adding to the discussion. I learn from you guys as you're commenting. So please keep coming back and keep doing it. I'll take any feedback if you think that the show could be better or what we're doing here could actually be improved. We're open to it. No ego investment in it staying the same. So thank you all so much. Appreciate you.
Thanks, Chris.